let them know that they can watch this if they go to the board website. My name is Bruce Burton. If you know the structure of our organization, we have 3 branches, 2 field branches and a program management branch, and I'm manager of the Northern California Field Operations Branch, which is all our field operations in Northern California. I'm overseeing this rule this regulation being adopted because our reg unit is busy with other things like 123 TCP and the Hexchrome lawsuit and a few other things. We're hoping to get this adopted in 2018. The regulation adoption process is long and arduous. There's a lot of I's to dot and T's to cross. But this morning we're going to talk about California's version of the revised total coliform rule. We're holding these workshops now because we're looking for your comments and your questions before we go into the formal reg adoption process and the formal 45-day public comment period, because we'd like to identify what the issues are beforehand and do what we can to correct them so that when we're in the formal process, we've already taken care of most of the issues. We're a pretty small group today, so also whenever we give presentations on regulations, they can be somewhat mind-numbing because we are going to go through the proposed regulations section by section. So I would really like you all, when you have a question or when you have a comment, to ask it then or state it then, because otherwise you may be asleep in a half an hour. So, and I want this to be as interactive as we can. Like I said, this is the 5th workshop we've done, and we've gotten quite a number of comments, and if you comment on something, I'll tell you that we've gotten comments on that, and we're considering what changes we can make for it, so you know you're not the only one. Let me turn that on. There's only one graphic in this entire presentation, and this is it. It just shows you that the majority of what we're going to adopt is the federal rule. There's some things that we're not adopting in the federal rule, and there are things that aren't in the federal rule that we're adopting. Some are things that are in our current TCR that are more stringent than the federal RTCR that we're going to keep. There's some things in the federal RTCR that just say, you water system have to do what the state tells you. And so we need to actually put those things in the regulation because unlike the federal government that can adopt its rules and implement them using guidance, in California, because we have this prohibition against underground regulations, which guidance is often viewed as, we need to be as specific as we can in the regulation. So that's why there are things in the regulation that in the federal rule, like I said, it just says you have to do what the state says. California doesn't work like that. And then there's some additional requirements in the existing total coliform rule that we're just keeping. These are just a set of acronyms that are used in the rule. And I know the handout you have is small and hard to read, but this handout is on our website. And at the end of the presentation, I'll show you how to get to it, but you'll be able to print out a larger copy if you want to. Okay, starting off, there's some new definitions. Clean compliance history. That's essentially if you've had no monitoring violations, no MCL violations, no coliform treatment technique violations, and we'll talk about what that means, and no treatment technique trigger exceedances, and we'll talk about that, what that means later in the presentation. The level 1 and level 2 assessments are defined. Protected water source is essentially an aquifer that has a physical barrier to preclude microbiological contaminants.
I have a question.
Sure.
So if you have a limit
if you have to do a level 1 assessment, you've exceeded a treatment technique trigger, and you would no longer have a clean compliance history. And we'll get into more detail. Clean compliance history is usually for a 12-month period. Sanitary defect is just what it sounds like. It's essentially something that would present a pathway to contamination, microbiological contamination of your water system. It could be an actual defect, or it could be a potential one where the system could where a contaminant could eventually enter your system. And then a seasonal system is a new term, new type of water system that's defined in the federal rule, and it's just a system that doesn't operate year-round. It's usually a transient or a non-transient system. And it probably could be some of these mountain systems where people are there. When they're there, they're living there full-time, but they're not open year-round. As we go through the presentation, everything you see in red is different from our existing total coliform rule. So it's either in the federal rule or it's something that we've added to the federal rule. So laboratory and personnel, these are things that are in the existing rule. And I'm not going to go through what's in the existing rule, existing total coliform rule in detail unless you have questions about it, but there are things you've been operating under for quite a few years. So general requirements. A couple new things. If your system is using groundwater and it's continually disinfected, the RTCR, proposed RTCR, is going to require quarterly raw water samples from your sources. Many of you do that now, and in many of our district offices it's required. Usually it's either done by asking you to do it or it's put in your permit as a permit condition. Yes?
Right, would you
So the question was, will you have to do these raw water samples if you're not using the well on a regular basis? And that's a good question that we haven't asked before. We had a discussion about inactive wells, or I'm sorry, not inactive wells, standby wells. And we're not going to require them for standby wells, but we probably need to put something in the draft to address wells that aren't used. I know in the current waterworks standards, if you have a well offline for 3 months and you bring it back on, you're required now to do a back sample before you serve water to the public. So that may just take care of the issue. Right.
But we do our.
We'll have to talk about it, but it seems to make sense to me. If you have a well offline greater than 3 months, then the current waterworks standards deals with that. You have to take a back sample when you use it again, and I think that would take care of that. Oh, there's a new requirement in the existing total coliform rule for operators that aren't certified. They need to be trained if they're going to take back samples, and that requirement doesn't change. There's just an addition that you have to keep documentation of that training. So that's the only change there. And then just to make it clear, we're adding the last bullet that plans, procedures, requests have to be made in writing. And you'll need to deal with your either local primacy agency or your district engineer, but in the day we live in now where a lot of our communication is by email, that probably is sufficient. but those requests just have to be made in writing, so there's essentially, so there's no misunderstandings. The federal RTCR requires, and the state RTCR is going to require, that you will have a bacteriological sample siting plan that meets the requirements of the RTCR. And in the rule, in the draft as it's written, you'll be given 3 months to do that. However, for most of you, you probably won't have to do anything, because in California, you've always had to tell us where the locations of your repeat sample sites are. And when the groundwater rule was passed, we revised our form to require you to put your groundwater rule sampling sites in if that was applicable to you. And those are the two major requirements that were added in the federal rule. So we believe that almost everybody here, all the water systems should have a sample siting plan that meets the requirements now and won't really have to do anything for this. But if you have any doubt, you should just talk to your LPA or your district office. The other bullets on this are essentially the requirements that are in there now. So, first bullet here, this is something that we had an internal discussion about, because nowhere in our existing TCR does it say you have to sample in accordance with your plan. So this was just put in there, put in the RTCR to make sure it's clear that you have to sample in accordance with your plan. Has to be updated at least once every 10 years. Has to be updated within 30 days of when you, the public water system, or we, the state board or LPA, determines it's no longer representative of your distribution system. And we'll talk about this when we get to repeat samples, but if it's no longer representative, if the alternative you have proposed to set sampling sites is no longer representative. So this table shows you the required monitoring frequencies, and nothing has changed except that one orange cell up there for non-transient, non-community water systems. In the existing TCR, there was an option that they could be allowed to go to quarterly sampling, and that will not be an option in the proposed rule. Everything else is the same. Transient systems serving less than 1,000 will be able to monitor quarterly, but there are, go to the next slide. There are specific requirements for transient systems on quarterly having to go to monthly, and then also there are specific requirements that allow them to go back to quarterly. And seasonal systems, in the federal rule, it allowed seasonal systems to monitor quarterly, but some seasonal systems aren't even open for a full quarter. So under the proposed federal rule, under the proposed state rule, seasonal systems are monitored on a monthly basis. Anybody here operate a seasonal system that's shut down part of the year? Okay, I won't spend a lot of time on seasonal systems. Yes? For non-community, non-transient.
Okay.
For non-transient, non-community, it will be monthly. Oh, just for distribution system samples, sorry. So non-transient, non-community systems will be required to take monthly distribution system bacteriological samples. What am I on? The first bullet is in the federal rule. It seems kind of obvious, but I think they wanted to put it in there to make sure there was no misunderstanding that if you get an E. coli positive sample that violates the MCL, you still have to finish taking your monthly, whatever the required number of monthly samples you're supposed to take. Having an MCL violation doesn't allow you to stop sampling, which I know none of you would do, but it's in the rule. And the other bullets here are essentially in the existing rule. You can take more than the minimum number required, but if you want to do that, it has to be in your bacteriological sample siting plan. If you're using an unfiltered surface water, which I doubt if anyone in here is, you have to take 1 sample a day when the turbidity is greater than 1 NTU. And you have to notify the state board within 10 days after learning of a routine monitoring violation and notify the public in a tier 3. I'll talk about it a little later, but the federal rule has divided monitoring and reporting violations, whereas right now under the current TCR, a monitoring and reporting violation is just 1 violation. Sample analysis and reporting. The changes here are all total coliform positive samples must be analyzed for E. coli. That probably won't, from a practical standpoint, won't be a change because with the current coli alert type methods, that's just a routine thing that's done. All repeat and additional routine samples will have to be reported in terms of coliform density. Additional samples, if you recall in the existing TCR, if a system takes 1 Bacti sample a month or less, if they have a positive total coliform sample, in the following month they have to take 5 samples. Under the TCR, that's RTCR, that's reduced to 3 samples. So that's the additional, that's what an additional sample is in the RTCR. And right now in California it's 5, but when we adopt it will be 3. When? We're hoping in sometime in 2018. 18, no, let's not. We're slow, but we're not that slow. And then there's one change in the final bullet. Right now, under the existing TCR, water systems have to require their laboratories to notify them when they get positive samples. And by the way, under the ELAP regulations, laboratories are also required to notify. But the change is that you as a water system have to supply your laboratory with a name and contact information for somebody they can call, just so they don't call a general line and leave a message on a voicemail. So that's the change there. Analysis and reporting, most of this is in the existing rule. We did have a discussion. In the existing TCR, there's a requirement that everybody has to submit a monthly summary of the number of samples they've taken. And we thought it really doesn't make a lot of sense if you only have to take 1 sample a month that you also have to submit a summary. So essentially we're changing it that if you only have to take 1 sample a month, once this goes into effect, you won't have to also submit another piece of paper telling us you took 1 sample a month. The final 2 bullets, these are in the existing rule now, and in actually looking at these, we realized that it would be a rare occurrence, but a water system could meet both of those conditions at the same time. So that language will be changed. It hasn't been changed yet, but. If a public water system fails to test the same sample for E. coli following a TC positive routine sample, you're supposed to notify the state within 10 days. And this is language out of the federal rule. And it's a tier 3 public notification. This doesn't make necessarily a lot of sense from a practical standpoint, because you, the water system, probably aren't going to fail to analyze your total coliform positive sample for E. coli. For some reason, the lab will have done that. Now, if you told them not to do it, then it's on you. But if for some reason the lab did that, then you may not have control of that. And this was brought up at an earlier workshop about how we will handle this in the regulation, and we have to get together and talk about that, because we don't, we hadn't thought about it before, but I don't know if it can be incorporated into some kind of invalidation, but that's an issue. But anyway, if it happens, you have to notify us within 10 days, but you'll probably know about it a lot sooner. And then failure to report to the state within 10 days is a reporting violation. And this is what I was talking about earlier. Under our existing TCR, we had monitoring and reporting violations. They were a package. The federal RTCR has separated them. You have monitoring violations and you have reporting violations. So what under the existing TCR is one violation, under the federal RTCR and our RTCR we're going to adopt, because we have to be as stringent as the federal rule, will now be 2 violations. And I'm not sure why they did that, but that's the way it's going to be. And that's, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you could have under the RTCR, you could exceed a treatment technique trigger and have to do an assessment, which is not a violation. So that's probably one reason why they did that, because if you don't do the assessment, that's the violation. Repeat sampling, the first slide is pretty much same as it is in current TCR, except that if you took one sample a month or less, you were under TCR, you're required to do 4 repeat samples, and under the RTCR, everyone is going to be required to just do 3 repeat samples. Also, the corresponding change is if you have a single connection system under the existing rule, you could take all your samples in 4 consecutive days, and they changed it to 3 consecutive days, since you're only going to have to take 3 repeat samples. So repeat sampling locations, you have the option of the same as the existing TCR, original site, 5 connections upstream, 5 connections downstream, but you also have these alternative sampling locations, and this is language out of the federal rule. Well, first off, if your positive is at the end of a system, and your routine site shouldn't be at the end of the system, but I could see maybe one of your repeat sites would be at the end of a system, you can choose other locations. But again, it has to be in your Bacterial sample siting plan. And then you can propose alternative sampling sites that may represent the likely pathway of contamination to your distribution system. And you can either choose set sites, or you can have a standard operating procedure where you choose repeat sample sites based on positives you get. I'm not quite sure how that will work, because from a regulatory standpoint, if you know of points in your system that are likely contamination pathways, I would think you would take care of those beforehand and not wait till you have a positive sample. So I'm not sure how this is going to work from a practical standpoint, but I'm interested in if you want to submit one. I'd like to read it. Yes? Right. Well, it's two different requirements. One is for repeat sampling. If you take one or less samples per month, if you have a positive, right now you have to take 4 repeat samples. Under the RTCR, it'll only be 3. There's also the requirement if you take 1 or fewer samples per month, in this next month you have to take 5 samples, and that will go down to 3. Close, but not quite the same thing. Dual purpose sampling, if you're subject to the groundwater rule, this hasn't changed. And then this is another thing that we realized wasn't in our current TCR, is nowhere in there did it say we had to approve your bacteriological sample siting plan. So we're putting that in there just so there's no misunderstanding there. Yes. Well, if what you have meets the requirements of the existing the RTCR, and I think for most of you it will, we're not going to go through that whole sending you letters saying what you have is approved because you've had it. But when people submit new plans or amended plans, then we'll. I mean, it's always been understood, because if you submitted a plan to us previously and we didn't like it, we told you to do it over again. So it's just now it's in the rule. Yes?
I'm assuming.
Yes, I would say by and large that's true. There may be special circumstances, but again, talk to your district engineer. But
Our office is fine with it.
yeah, so the question was, in today's electronic communication atmosphere, that email back and forth is adequate for receiving an approval. Yes? No, if you're regulated by an LPA, a local primacy agency, that's your regulatory agency, and that's all you need is the LPA approval. Okay, repeat sampling. If you have 1 or more total coliform positive samples, repeat samples that are total coliform positive, you have to continue to collect repeat samples until you get a clean set of repeat samples, or until you've exceeded a treatment trigger and notified the state board of the LPA. So that's repeat samples. But if you exceed a treatment trigger by a positive routine sample, you only have to take 1 set of repeat samples, no matter what they are, because you've exceeded the treatment trigger. I'm not sure why they made this differentiation. This is in the federal rule, but sample invalidation requirements are essentially the same. I don't know if the existing TCR, I can't remember, has a requirement that the invalidation request be made in writing, but it does in RTCR. Oh, and this is This is somewhat obvious too, but it's in the federal rule, and I guess it's for clarification, that if you have an invalidated sample, it does not count towards the number of samples you have to take in that month. You have to take a replacement sample, so just to be clear. The other bullets there are all in the existing TCR. Before you had your invalidation? Oh, okay. Say, well, if you took repeat samples based on a positive that was later invalidated, so your repeat samples are from the original site and 5 connections upstream and downstream, sure, that would count. Okay, significant rise in bacterial count. This is a California only requirement, which we're keeping. But what I want to stress here is the section, regulation section is titled significant rise in bacterial count. But essentially what, if you meet the conditions, it's a possible significant rise in bacterial count. And I just want to stress possible, because these conditions require you to do things, but there hasn't been any violation. There hasn't been any requirement to do public notification until we collaborate and decide, is it a real problem or isn't it a real problem? So the conditions in this section are a possible rise, and then if we determine that, yes, it's a real problem, then it is a rise, and there are notification requirements. There are a couple changes that you have to notify us by the end of the day on which you receive the positive bacteria results that indicate that there's a possible rise. Right now in the existing regulation, it says you have to tell us on that day, or if the office is already closed within 24 hours. But we changed it because you all have emergency notification plans, you all have phone numbers of district engineers or LPA staff, and you all have our phone numbers and our emails, so you can notify us that day. You can somehow notify us. So, and then we added significant rise is always required. Possible significant rise is always required in an investigation, and if you find issues, if you find deficiencies that need to be corrected, you just need to give us a timeline under which you'll correct those. If you have an E. coli positive, it's a possible significant rise, which requires you to do an investigation to determine if it's a real problem. It may not be, yeah.
So it depends on the state.
It depends on the state or LPA staff evaluating the information that you give us based on what the issue is, right?
So in some area.
Well,
Possible or not, right?
The significant rise in bacterial count isn't the language in the regulation isn't in terms of violation. It never says there's a violation. It just says if it's determined that there's a possible significant rise, then water systems have to implement their emergency notification plan. And that may lead to a violation, but that of and in itself isn't a violation.
I thought E. coli
No, it's not.
is possible significant rise.
It's a possible significant rise, but one E. coli hit is not an MCL violation. And that's one of the reasons they have this there, because if you get one, they want to investigate it to see if it's real. Okay, these are the conditions that in the draft reg that represent a significant rise, a possible significant rise. If you take more than 40 samples a month and you get a positive, a TC positive, and 2 of your repeats are positive, you haven't exceeded the MCL, you haven't exceeded the E. coli MCL, but we want an investigation. And then, goes to your question, if a system has a sample that's positive for E. coli, so just one E. coli, and then this third condition, which we've got a number of comments on, essentially this 23 NPN corresponded to 10 tubes positive under the old multiple tube, or 23 colony forming units under a membrane filter. We're reevaluating that. No, it's significant rise in bacterial count is strictly a California requirement.
So this is
Yeah, this is not in the federal RTCR. Yes. Right. Right now, in the current draft of our RTCR, the only samples that are required to be enumerated, have a density reading, are the additional routine samples taken in the month after a positive and in repeat samples. So that they would only apply to those. Not now. Under the existing rule, they don't have to be. Our proposed RTCR, they have to be. But one thing I forgot to mention, the requirement for those additional samples under the RTCR only apply to systems on quarterly monitoring. So they're only going to apply to transients that are on quarterly monitoring. No, 500 is heterotrophic plate count. Yeah. Yes. Right. Everybody who does repeats has to enumerate, but the additional samples requirement is only applicable to systems who are on quarterly monitoring in the proposed RTCR, so they're the only routine or samples that will have to be enumerated.
so that all the systems contact.
Yeah, let me stress again, this is the proposed regulation, and right now you're under the federal regulation and the federal RTCR and the state TCR. The state TCR does not require this. So anything that California is requiring that's more stringent than the federal RTCR proposing to require is not in effect right now. So I wouldn't do it right now. Yes. Yeah, it's just on the repeats, right? Right, not the routine samples, except for the additional routine samples It's only on the repeat samples that we're going to require density analysis. Yes?
Clarification.
You have to enumerate, well, again, it's only on repeat samples, so if you get a total coliform positive sample and you have to take repeat samples, they have to be enumerated.
All of
Yes,
it, no matter what.
until we adopt this, which you'll know. No, if you're taking routine samples and you're analyzing them for presence absence, if you get a total coliform positive, that sample, then you shine the UV light on it to see if it's E. coli positive. But it's just presence absence. Well, if there's no total coliform, there's no E. coli. So
Right, but I meant.
right. But again, it's shining the UV light on the quantitray. The significant rise in bacterial count requires an investigation. There's some wordsmithing that has gone into it, but essentially the requirements are the same as in the existing TCR. You just have to look at your system operation, pressure losses, interruption of treatment, vandalism, evidence indicating contamination, analytical results, and if there's any community illness that's suspected. I mentioned this before, there's a requirement to notify us within 24 hours of a significant rise. And again, it's notifying us that the conditions exist for a possible significant rise. And then you do an investigation and we look at it and decide if it merits a public notice. Right. I think you're right. So it is the day the day that you're notified of that. So we'll change that. Yes. Significant rises for all public water systems, so transient, non-transient, non-community, and community. So E. coli MCL, the RTCR does away with the total coliform MCL. That'll be gone. So there's only going to be one MCL in the RTCR, and that's an E. coli maximum contaminant level. So if you have a repeat E. coli positive after a total coliform positive, that's an E. coli MCL. If you have a repeat total coliform positive after a routine E. coli positive, that's an MCL violation. If you get a E. coli positive routine sample and you don't take your repeat samples, that's an MCL violation. And then if you fail to test for E. coli when you get any repeat total coliform positive sample, that last bullet I don't think will be an issue because I think it's pretty standard practice now. Laboratories, if they get a positive total coliform sample, they look to see if it's E. coli positive. Well, it's new in so far as it's an E. coli MCL violation. There didn't used to be an E. coli MCL violation. It was just a total coliform MCL violation. So it's new from that standpoint, that bullet. The one condition, the third bullet, that you fail to take the repeat samples when you get an E. coli positive is something you don't want to do, because an E. coli MCL is a tier 1 notification, and you want to take your repeat samples because you may not have to do a tier 1 notification. No, the second bullet takes care of that. Essentially, a repeat sample is total coliform positive following a routine E. coli positive. So if the routine was E. coli positive, it's also total coliform positive. So that's that condition. So if you have a total coliform and E. coli positive routine sample, you have to have a total coliform repeat positive for it to be an MCL violation. So this is notification. You just need to notify us by the end of the day after you find out you've had an E. coli MCL violation. And the requirement in the rule is a tier 1 public notice if you have an E. coli MCL violation. It may or may not be. You have to notify your customers and tell them that you've had this E. coli positive, and I would say in many of the instances it will be, but I can't say it. That's a blanket condition.
What was the question?
The question was if you have an E. coli MCL violation, is that an automatic boil water notice when you do your notification? In most instances probably will be, but I can't say in 100%. This is a new section, a coliform treatment technique. And this is a little confusing because they never tell you what a coliform treatment technique is. They only tell you what a violation of a coliform treatment technique is. And essentially, if you fail to conduct an assessment you're required to conduct or turn it in, that's a violation. Or if you're a seasonal system and you fail to do your required startup procedure. It's just a little confusing. I think it's probably a tier 2. I'm pretty sure it's a tier 2. I didn't put that down, but it's comparable to other things that are tier 2s. Yeah, the question was, is a coliform treatment technique violation a tier 3 or tier 2 violation, notification requirement? I think it's a tier 2, but I'll check on that. Yeah, this is in effect right now because of the federal rule, but something I didn't start off with, but California is implementing the federal rule. We're telling everybody what it is. We're not enforcing it. But when there are violations, EPA knows it. I mean, we have to notify EPA of those. Okay, coliform, yes. Can you give me a little more detail? So essentially, it's a very small system, and it's a transient because of the restaurant.
Correct.
But the restaurant only operates on a seasonal basis.
Correct.
So the restaurant is one connection on this very small system. Well, actually, because the restaurant shuts down, when the restaurant shuts down, you no longer meet the definition of a public water system because you only have 4 connections. A good question. If the water system itself operates year-round, it's pressurized year-round, and people are using it year-round, I think that would be essentially like one of your customers deciding they are not going to take water for a while, and it would really be on that customer to make sure their internal plumbing system was fine. So I don't think you as a water system your distribution system comes up to the point of serving the restaurant. That's pressurized year-round. It's being used year-round. So I would just say it's not really applicable to the seasonal system concept. Right. So there's a question of what about a campground with a full-time caretaker who lives there? The water system is pressurized year-round. There are provisions, we haven't gotten to that section of the reg yet, but there are provisions within the startup procedure for systems that are pressurized year-round where they can propose an alternative to what the requirements are for the startup procedures. So that's addressed. Because we know if it's pressurized year-round, it's not the same as if you've depressurized and you've had stuff from the outside leaking into your pipes. So there's a provision for that in the regulation. Where am I? Oh, coliform treatment technique triggers. Determining a trigger exceedance includes, this is the samples, routine and repeat samples and replacement samples. To determine if you've exceeded a trigger does not include special samples, like if your system pressure goes less than 5 psi or your quarterly raw water samples. So level 1 coliform treatment technique trigger. Do any of these conditions look familiar? They should, because the first 2 are the old TCR MCL violation. And then failure to take all required repeat samples after any total coliform positive sample. Remember, if you fail to take your repeat samples after an E. coli positive sample, that's an MCL violation. But if you fail to take your repeat samples after just a total coliform positive sample, you've exceeded level 1 treatment trigger, and you have to do a level 1 assessment, which we'll talk about. So this is gets into the whole aspect of the RTCR, the find and fix aspect. If there's a problem, they want you to find it and fix it instead of issuing you a violation for an MCL violation. You've just exceeded a trigger, which is not a violation. It's just exceeding a trigger. And you just do your assessment and hopefully find. So level 2 treatment triggers, if you have an E. coli MCL violation, that's a level 2 trigger. And then if you have a second level 1 trigger exceedance within a 12-month period, that's kicks you into a level 2 assessment. With the exception, though, is if you have a level 1 assessment, you do your level 1 assessment, you find the issue and you fix the issue, then if you have a second level 1 assessment within 12 months, the first one doesn't count towards that kicking you into a level 2 assessment. It's the idea there is you did the assessment, you found the problem, you took care of it, that's done. And it it doesn't go into the future with your next assessment. So your assessments have to include these 5 elements. You have to look at your sample sites and your sampling protocol and processing. You have to look at any events in your distribution system that could have affected water quality, any changes in the distribution system operating and maintenance that could have affected the water quality, any source or treatment considerations, and any existing water quality data. In the federal rule, it indicates that assessments have to be conducted as soon as practical after exceeding the trigger. How you enforce as soon as practical is, I'm not sure. But they also have a deadline. It has to be done within 30 days and turned into your regulatory agency, either the state or the LPA staff. Water systems can conduct level 1 assessments, and we've had quite a few conducted since the federal rule went into effect. We do have level 1 assessment forms up on our website. State board staff or LPA staff are conducting the level 2 assessments, the actual come out there and look at the system. The federal rule allowed third parties to do those assessments, and we thought from a practical standpoint, for especially for small systems, trying to contract with somebody to come out and do your assessment and get it done and turned into us within 30 days would be problematic. So that's the main reason we have chosen to have our staff do the assessments. We're committed to, once you notify us that you've exceeded a level 2 trigger, we're committed to being out at your system within a week, and then within another week having a report to you so that you can meet that 30-day requirement of turning in your report to us. For a level 2 assessment, your part of that is correcting whatever deficiencies are found within that time, or giving us a schedule when you'll have those deficiencies corrected. The 30-day time period is pretty tight. We understand it's pretty tight, and we think it could be a problem at times. There's a provision within the federal rule that we're adopting, though, that says if you turn in an assessment with us within the 30-day period and we determine that it's not adequate, we can give it back to you and give you another 30 days. So from a practical standpoint, if you're having to do an assessment and it's just not going to get done within 30 days, my recommendation would be to turn it into us and tell us you just can't get it done within 30 days. And then within the law, we can say, okay, it's not adequate, and give it back to you and give you another 30 days. That way, there won't be a violation. We understand that 30 days sometimes can be pretty tight. So there is that provision within the federal rule, and we're going to adopt that. So I would keep that in mind if you have to do an assessment, and for whatever reason you can't get it done in 30 days. Now, if you try to game the system, we may not give you another 30 days, but it's been our experience that overwhelming majority of you all want to do a great job, and you're trying to provide safe water to your system, so we want to work with you if that becomes an issue. I would just talk to your district engineer, your LPA, as you're going through this, so there aren't any surprises. And I just think I covered most of this slide. One other thing that's specifically called out in the federal rule, and that is also called out in our rule, is you can exceed a trigger and you can do your assessment and you cannot find what the issue was. it's acceptable to turn in an assessment to us saying, we did the assessment, this is what we looked at, and we did not find a deficiency that would have led to this trigger exceedance. I've been in this business a long time, and I have seen multiple instances where a system got positive samples that would have exceeded this trigger. And we looked for a long time, and we never found the cause. And that just happens sometimes. So that's specifically called out in the regulation, that you do the best you can, and if you can't find it, sometimes that happens. Now, I went over this also, that if you can't get it done, the law will allow another 30 days if we find that it's not adequate. The law indicates that you're supposed to complete the corrective actions that need within that 30-day period. Again, from a practical standpoint, that's not going to happen all the time. So you just need to give us a schedule for completing correcting any deficiencies that have been found. And then under the federal rule states that you have to notify us when you correct a deficiency that's been identified. It doesn't say when you have to notify us. So we chose 5 business days as a thinking that would be enough time. Just because if you don't have a time deadline, it's not enforceable. Well, it is, the 5-day is, but right now the federal rule says you need to notify us when you correct a deficiency, but it doesn't say when. So. Yeah, and that's fine under the current federal rule. And I would say talk to whoever's regulating you, because if you're making a good faith effort, this is not. We had to put a date in there to make it enforceable, but this is not. If you're making good faith effort, we're going to work with you on that. Yes. Well, you're right. The corrective actions are for correcting the deficiencies you find, and if you don't find any deficiencies, there are really no corrective actions. You may want to say we've tightened up our sampling procedure or whatever, but technically the way it's written is the corrective actions are for correcting the deficiencies you find. If you find no deficiencies, there's really nothing to report, although I think most of us understand that we could always do a little better. So. On your handout, on this slide, it says failure of any of the following reporting requirements is a violation requiring a Tier 2 public notice. And that's an error. It should be Tier 3, just so, and that's corrected on this presentation. It'll be corrected on the website after we put up the correction, but it is these are Tier 3 notifications, which means you have to do them within 12 months, and you can use your CCR if you have to do a consumer confidence report to report those. I don't think we have any startup systems that have to do startup, but in case we do, the federal requirement, the federal rule just says water system, you have to do complete a startup plan specified by the state. They didn't specify what it is. So we have specified elements of what a startup plan has to be for a Seasonal system, you have to notify us prior to startup. You have to inspect all the system components. You have to disinfect and flush the flushing procedures, bacteriological sampling and chlorine sampling. You have to use a certified operator for startup procedures. And failure to notify the state board or LPA and or submit a startup plan, sampling results is a violation. However, that being said, we have gotten a number of comments, and we know that those particular elements don't meet all the situations. One comment we got was, we don't disinfect our system routinely, so we don't want to disinfect our system because it may cause us problems. And that's a fair question. So in the draft regulation itself, there's a provision for a water system, seasonal system, to propose an alternative to what's in the standard procedure in the regulation based on their particular circumstances. And we both have to agree that it is as protective of public health, and you're still going to have to do back-T samples to show that the system's clean. So there will be provisions in the draft regulation to propose alternatives to the set procedure that's in there. In seasonal systems, prior to serving water to the public, you have to certify that you've completed the approved startup plan and obtain written approval from the state board or LPA that you can serve water to the public. And then when you shut down, you just have to notify the state board or LPA that you have shut down. Yes? No, they have to submit a startup plan, and once that plan is submitted and approved, then that's what they would do every year. So in your instance where you have a campground in the high country that doesn't normally chlorinate, the water's really clean, if they propose, we're going to flush the system and repressurize it and take back T samples, and if they're clean, then that'll be our procedure. And if that's approved, then that's just what you would do every year. But that system would have to notify the state or LPA, we've done our approved startup procedure and we want to serve the public now and get approval to do that. We'll have template for startup procedure based on the requirements in the rule. If you're proposing an alternative, you can submit it. I think you could submit it via email, but it would have to be an attachment. It would have to be an actual plan document. Right. And we would have it on file, or the LPA would have it on file in their office. I would say the question was, if you get a total coliform positive on a normally unchlorinated system, do you then have to disinfect? I would say that depends on what's in your plan, what's approved. If you want to try again and see that it's clean, that's probably not unreasonable, but you can't serve water to the public until it's clean. So at some point you may have to disinfect. Disinfection residual, the California rule will require that you measure and report the disinfection residual of all additional routine samples that have to be taken. That's the samples that have to be taken by systems on quarterly monitoring after they have a positive, and all repeat samples. And then if you're a surface water, you're going to be taking chlorine residuals anyway, and you can use those. Now, oh, I'm behind on the slides, sorry. Starting with slide 40, there's 10 more slides, and the next 10 slides are just other changes to other regulations that have to be made because we're going to adopt the RTCR. So, for instance, we're revising our groundwater rule because to say that essentially in the existing groundwater rule it says you have to comply with the TCR. Now it's going to say you have to comply with the RTCR. Under best available technology, it's going to find affordable technology for systems serving less than 10,000, best available technology, and this is best available technology for the RTCR, not the TCR. And it defines specific elements are given that are defined as part of a proper program for maintenance of the distribution system. That's one of the best available technologies. Again, these are existing requirements but they may have been changed just to remove references to TCR and insert references to RTCR. Tier 1 notification, total coliform MCL has been replaced by the E. coli MCL, so there's different language for that. Under Tier 2, again, the total coliform MCL has been replaced by a violation of a coliform treatment technique. Remember, the coliform treatment technique are failure to do your startup plan or failure to turn in your assessment or do your assessment. Tier 3 notification, failure to comply with the reporting requirements of RTCR, and failure to comply with the record-keeping requirements of RTCR. Public notice and content and format. There's removal of language for total coliform, new language for total coliform in the Consumer Confidence Report, because total coliform has the MCL violation language is being removed and treatment technique triggers are being inserted. And then removal of language for the fecal and E. coli and replacement of language just for E. coli because fecal coliform is no longer an acceptable analysis for RTCR. There's additional language for level 1 assessments and level 2 assessments for the CCR, additional language for seasonal system treatment technique violation, addition of a requirement to keep copies of level 1 and 2 assessments and documentation of corrective action taken for not less than 5 years, an additional requirement to keep copies of repeat Bacti samples for which an extension of the 24-hour collection or delivery requirement was given. That doesn't happen too often. Language to provide in the CCR for level 1 and level 2 assessments. Removal of language associated with total coliform MCL, addition of required language associated with level 1 and level 2 assessments not due to an E. coli MCL violation and due to an E. coli MCL violation. There's language required for the required for calendar year 2016 is your, And this will probably go away because we were originally thinking we could get this adopted in 2017, but for your 2016 CCR, you're just only subject to the California total coliform rule. And then a health effects language for total coliform, fecal coliform, and E. coli have been changed. And then under surface water treatment, it's just essentially the changes from complying with our total coliform rule to complying with RTCR. So those are just changes to other regulations that have to be done so that they mesh up with total coliform rule, the RTCR. So as I said, you can get to this information on our website. If you go to our website, the Drinking Water Program website, and you look under this quick links, you can see circled there is the revised total coliform rule. That'll take you to our revised total coliform rule page. And then under the revised total coliform rule, there's the draft regulation is up there now, and also the revised total coliform rule workshop presentation, and we'll update it with that one error we found. And then, if you have other comments or questions, we have this email address, rtcr@waterboards.ca.gov. So if you think of something later, please send us your comments or send us your questions. We have a small work group of field staff who are working on this, and we monitor that website and respond to those questions or comments. But if you do have comments, or you think of something later, think of some suggestion, we'd appreciate it if you would send those to us so we can take them into account. Yes? The draft rule out? Well, there's a draft up here now, but the draft rule when we go into the formal rulemaking process, it'll probably be in the fall. Right, but that's a probably. Yes? Okay, thank you. You have saved me from pouring through that to find where that error was. Okay, so that's what we have for you today. If you have any other questions, I can be around for a while, but I appreciate you coming, and we're hoping to actually adopt this regulation sometime. So, thank you. You're released.